What is counterterrorism? What are the strategies, practices, and tactics that various actors use to counter terrorism? How might those tactics be beneficial or perhaps more importantly harmful for society? How do actors rationalize, justify, and legitimate their counterterrorism strategies? In the context of growing public concern over issues related to privacy, how do government authorities, law enforcement agencies, and private corporations observe the masses? And what are the implications of this? On this episode, we're talking all about counterterrorism, surveillance, and policing. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm a criminologist studying discourses related to terrorism and practices associated with counterterrorism. On this episode, we are talking all about counterterrorism. Countering terrorism is indeed an overarching goal of governments and state actors across the world. Look no further than the annual threat assessments published by governments across various jurisdictions, or the all-encompassing counterterrorism strategies developed and funded in many jurisdictions. These strategies aim explicitly to provide roadmaps for the cooperation of a number of actors with the primary goal of working together to prevent terrorism from occurring. Broadly speaking, counterterrorism is a catch-all term for describing the practices, tactics, techniques, and strategies used by governments, military, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, and private entities to prevent, stop, disrupt, or manage terrorism. Within many jurisdictions, counterterrorism not only involves federal or national agencies like intelligence agencies, but also international practices and organizations of law enforcement like Interpol. Increasingly, it also includes, in varying degrees, local police institutions and even private security contractors like G4S and other security providers. One of the main tactics associated with counterterrorism is the collection, monitoring, and observation of individual and group level behaviors, activities, communications, or interactions, or most commonly referred to as surveillance. Especially in the public sphere and among a host of civil liberty groups, the expression of surveillance often evokes strongly negative connotations of intelligence programs enacted by more or less formally organized security institutions that actively target a state's own citizens, rather than employed towards foreign individuals and groups that might pose risks to national security from abroad. As a cultural construct, surveillance at both foreign and domestic levels relates to a variety of mechanisms and structures of social control directed at gathering information from a population or population subset, which in some academic circles can be referred to as intelligence. As conditions differ across nations in legal, cultural, political, and other relevant respects, counterterrorism and surveillance operations are not always neatly defined. As we'll talk about a little bit later, some countries have a specialized domestic intelligence agency, but others, most notably the United States, do not. In the case of the United States, in fact, there isn't even an official definition of domestic intelligence, which impacts what domestic intelligence is from a government viewpoint and what it can and should be in terms of aspired goals and activities. And certainly, police are increasingly taking more active roles in larger governmental counterterrorism strategy and practice. Look no further than the massive rise of Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs, in the United States, and INSET, or Integrated National Security Enforcement Teams, in Canada, to understand the increased dependence on local, provincial, and federal law enforcement, and even private security, in the context of counterterrorism. In this video, we will admittedly focus mostly on the US and Canada, with a little bit of reference to the United Kingdom. While certainly this contributes to a very Western-centric understanding of counterterrorism surveillance and policing, I want us to have a nuanced discussion about the social consequences of the expansion of counterterrorism measures, and thus only want us to focus on a couple of case studies or we'll actually be here all day talking about different legislations and policies developed throughout the world. One of the most influential consequences of 9/11 was its impact on security apparatuses in much of the Western world. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, we saw a number of complete overhauls of governmental national security structures, the swift passing of a host of new legislation and government policy, and the redirection of material and financial resources towards counterterrorism portfolios in places like the United States, Canada, and the UK, as well as many other jurisdictions. This led to a complete restructuring of national security operations to focus almost exclusively on terrorism rather than other supposed threats to national security. In the United States, the months following 9/11 were understandably characterized by explicit responses to the tragic attacks. Militarily, this meant starting the much maligned War on Terror with Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, starting on October 7, 2001. At home, this also meant the massive restructuring of the national security apparatus, as it was seen as an inefficient and ineffective system that at least in some ways failed by allowing 9/11 to happen. In late October 2001, the United States passed the Uniting and Strengthening America by providing the appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act, or the USA Patriot Act, which dramatically tightened U.S. national security and provided a host of new tools to prevent terrorism. While there were thousands of legislative changes in the Patriot Act, it had three very large provisions. The first, it expanded law enforcement's ability to surveil and collect data on international and domestic communications. Second, it took down barriers to interagency communication, known in some circles as intelligence silos, to allow for more effective use of resources. And third, it increased penalties for crimes related to terrorism. Importantly, as we'll see, the U.S. Patriot Act was not only used by security and law enforcement officials in the U.S., it was also the inspiration for a number of similar legislations passed in a number of other jurisdictions, including Canada and the UK. Dovetailing the passing of the Patriot Act, then President George W. Bush established the Office of Homeland Security to oversee and coordinate all homeland security efforts at the federal level. The Office of Homeland Security was eventually renamed the Department of Homeland Security when it received full executive status in 2003. DHS is a federal executive department responsible for the entire national security portfolio and explicitly incorporates 22 agencies in the United States, including U.S. Customs, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, U.S. Secret Service, the Coast Guard, and the Federal Protection Service, among others. The goal of the creation of DHS was to make coordination and communication more efficient among the 22 incorporated agencies in order to prevent, stop, and manage terrorism, as well as other threats to the country. It thus completely restructured the ways in which information is shared, communicated, collected, and managed, and was specifically created as a response to 9/11 and terrorist activities and the ongoing threat of it. The passing of the Patriot Act and the restructuring of the national security apparatus in the United States thus represent significant governmental shifts in the ways in which terrorism is understood, managed, and acted upon that have influenced a host of counterterrorism practices operating at both the domestic and international levels. Like the US, following 9/11, Canada undertook a massive restructuring of its own security apparatus. Just as the US established the Department of Homeland Security to streamline counterterrorism operations under a single department, Canada amalgamated a number of security portfolios under the banner of the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness in 2003, which has since been renamed Public Safety Canada. This amalgamated a number of different agencies: the RCMP, CSIS, CSC, the RCMP, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Correctional Services Canada, and the Parole Board of Canada, and created the Canadian Border Services Agency to make the country's counterterrorism program more efficient and have it all under one roof. Canada also passed its counterterrorism specific legislation, called the Anti-Terrorism Act, in the months after 9/11, receiving royal assent in December of 2001. This omnibus bill, omnibus here meaning that it is a law that covers a number of diverse topics related to terrorism, extended the powers of government and governmental institutions within the Canadian national security apparatus, in order to help them respond to the threat of terrorism. Of particular concern here for legal scholars and critical sociologists, the Act enhanced police and governmental power to allow for in-camera or secret trials, preemptive detention without evidence of offense, and the massive expansion of surveillance powers that many have argued are incompatible with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. And we'll talk about one incompatible case in a few minutes. Importantly, the ongoing issues brought up by anti-terrorism laws in Canada necessitate continued empirical analysis from sociologists and legal scholars. These laws must be empirically analyzed for their consequences as issues arise. Indeed, the omnipresent threat of terrorism that is presented to the masses has been incredibly useful as a catalyst for state surveillance. But countering a common trope that 9/11 was the impetus for the development of state surveillance, Torrin Monahan highlights how there is a well-documented history of state-sponsored surveillance operations that long precedes the tragic events of September 11th. Two examples that Monahan pointed to were the Cold War-era echelon system, which is still in operation today, that intercepts satellite and other communications to spy on so-called enemies, and allies just the same. The other notable example of pre-9/11 state surveillance in the US is the infamous FBI and CIA COINTELPRO program that explicitly targeted civil rights leaders and protesters who opposed the war in Vietnam from at least 1956 to 1971. COINTELPRO was developed by the FBI to observe targeted groups deemed subversive, including the Communist Party USA, anti-Vietnam War groups, feminist organizations, civil rights groups, and leaders like the Nation of Islam and the American Indian Movement, and a variety of groups who were part of the New Left, as it was called. The program was bipartisan in nature and spanned a number of presidencies, from Franklin D. Roosevelt to Richard Nixon. The program's objective was to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, or otherwise neutralize groups that the FBI determined to be, quote, subversive. And field operatives were instructed to use a variety of tactics to accomplish this objective, including create negative public image for targeted groups, for example, by releasing sensitive information through surveillance, break down internal organization by creating conflicts, create dissension between groups, for example, by spreading rumors that one group was stealing money from another, to restrict access to public resources, to restrict the ability to organize and protest through agents promoting violence against police during protests, and to restrict the ability of individuals to participate in group activities, for example, by character assassination, false arrest, or surveillance. This is important for us as social scholars because, as I and Matthew DeFlem have highlighted, practices of state-sponsored so-called domestic spying like this are not legal in the United States. As a country typically thought to uphold free exchange of ideas and the stance that citizens do not have to worry about being persecuted for their political beliefs, the COINTELPRO program was an explicit and empirical example of how this has possibly never been the case. That the US has long attempted to restrict free speech through a variety of both legislation and surveillance programs like COINTELPRO. And the program's logics and rationales would not end with its cancellation in 1970, as we have seen in the number of years since. There has been a number of state-led attempts to observe, surveil, and collect data on the masses in the years since, not least of which is the now infamous PRISM program, developed by the United States National Security Agency, or NSA. Details of which were leaked by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden in 2013. Under this program, the NSA and other government authorities had access to a mechanism that collected user data from almost all major internet and tech companies, including Microsoft, Google, Apple, Yahoo, Verizon, Sprint, and others. PRISM was in many ways a culmination of a number of piecemeal or smaller and less consequential political and legislative changes made in the aftermath of 9/11, including the enactment of the USA Patriot Act and, perhaps more importantly, significant revisions made to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, in 2006 and 2007. Most notably here were changes to sections 702 of FISA and 215 of the Patriot Act, the former being the authorization to use content collected under PRISM, and the latter authorizing the collection of what is called metadata, or aggregate level data, data that gives information about data. This information was collected from phone companies and internet service providers like AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint. The triangulation of data at both the user and meta level allowed the NSA to use FISA and the Patriot Act together to use the authority granted by FISA to collect the user level data and the secret FISA intelligence courts to grant a much broader authority than they were given under the Patriot Act. In the eyes of the NSA, they only had to get FISA approval for the NSA's collection procedures, the PRISM and other programs, and not individual warrants for specific targets, even though they had both user and metadata. And this has raised a number of important concerns about privacy and civil and human rights, particularly in the context of mass expansion of internet communication technologies and social media. What powers do governments have to evade or bulldoze individual privacy in the name of counterterrorism? Is terrorism such a big threat that governments should be able to evade accountability for privacy violations to prevent it? What are the consequences of the increase in surveillance technologies across the world and often justified through reference to terrorist activity? These are just some of the empirical questions that surveillance scholars pose as they ponder the lasting effects of new surveillance technologies in the so-called war on terror. And while the entire PRISM program and its subsequent high-profile leak have been the focus of a number of popular media depictions, the program highlights the consequences inherently associated with using counterterrorism as the justification for increased surveillance without taking seriously civil liberties and privacy concerns. Counterterrorism has been massively successful as a placeholder justification for increased surveillance and police powers, and critical terrorism scholars have continued to levy critiques of their expansion as both unfounded and even inefficient, as not actually being that useful. In Canada, the situation is quite different because it is a whole different legislative approach to the legality of surveillance, particularly when it comes to domestic surveillance of its own citizens. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the Canadian Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, are responsible for domestic and international intelligence operations. Created by an Act of Parliament in 1984, CSIS was established as the sole agency responsible for internal surveillance, a function which until then was overseen by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who throughout the 70s and 80s had a variety of controversies that culminated in what's called the MacDonald Report that argued that there should be an entirely different organization and agency tasked with intelligence operations and a civilian oversight body to go with it. The creation of a dedicated intelligence agency was decided upon after the Royal Commission of Inquiry into certain activities of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had highlighted problems with the coexistence of intelligence and police powers in the RCMP. In the 1980s, CSIS primarily focused on counter-espionage, but from the 1990s onwards, its focus has been more and more directed at counterterrorism. The service is part of Public Safety Canada, the government department that was created in 2003 in succession of the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Strikingly, Canada has no official foreign intelligence service. Much of the scholarly attention paid to terrorism and counterterrorism has come from scholars and professionals interested in practical concerns of police operational efficiency and terrorist identification and interdiction. This body of work, albeit useful and important, focuses heavily on identifying the so-called best practices for local, federal, and international law enforcement officials. While such investigations have been and continue to be influential in the fields of police studies, international affairs, and public policy, they fail to address important questions related to how modern practices of policing terrorism come to be, and perhaps equally important, how the adoption of police strategies might be patterned and structured in variably novel and imperfect ways. Sociologists and criminologists have thus begun to focus on the pattern and cooperative nature of international counterterrorism policing networks and tactics. Indeed, since the early 2000s, a notable increase can be observed in academic interest in counterterrorism policing practices across national boundaries and increasingly within national boundaries. Shifting focus away from formal law enforcement as the sole agents of policing, scholars have developed an area of research that pays close attention to how strategies, practices, and networks of policing emerge in both the spatial and temporal dimensions that lie outside of capital P police. An emergent trend in the policing of terrorism is based in the creation of operational and strategic cooperation networks to counter terrorism. However, as we move into the third decade since the events of 9/11, the policing of terrorism and other counterterrorism approaches instituted by governments are changing in terms of organizational and public priorities at both the local and international levels. Such developments take place at different levels of public agencies, including politics, military, law, and police, both within and across national states. These various levels and dimensions of counterterrorism factually coexist, even though they may operate relatively independently on their own, respective of organizational logic or rationalization. For example, the military focus of the war on terror is accompanied by the criminal justice orientation of police agencies. Both practices have developed and coexist, even when their respective forms and objectives can conflict sharply. And with this qualification in mind, new terrorist threats and developments have led to an overarching shift towards the rearticulation of counterterrorism practices around preemptive intervention in this so-called radicalization process. It is therefore important for us to analyze contemporary forms of counterterrorism policy that are continuously shifting and developing around new social and political objectives, to articulate the level of government at which they are formulated and how they inform the practices of policing to which they pertain. In the years following 9/11, the Canadian government developed an approach to counterterrorism that shifted from the national space to the global. This move from counterterrorism as a national issue to an internationally oriented concern was reflected in both governmental communications about countering terrorism, as well as international cooperation on matters of public policy related to terrorism. For instance, in the latter years of the decade, Canadian politicians overwhelmingly began to adopt the notion of a global fight against terrorism, whilst establishing international cooperation networks and adopting similar policies as other jurisdictions to combat terrorism, highlighting the globalized threat of terrorism that had emerged. Immediately following the September 11th attacks, as the clearest example, the Omnibus Anti-Terrorism Act was passed by the Canadian government that mirrored the USA Patriot Act in many ways. Among the best documented instances of the adoption and implementation of germane counterterrorism policy is the establishment of a Canadian national framework to counter so-called radicalization. In 2012, following the release of the Air India Flight 182 Commission report, and at least influenced by a 2006 foiled plot against a variety of targets in southwestern Ontario, known as the Toronto 18, then Minister of Public Safety Vic Taves released the government's strategic plan entitled Building Resiliency Against Terrorism, Canada's Counterterrorism Strategy. The strategy, in some ways explicitly mirroring, and in other ways clearly influenced by a UK strategy called the Contest Framework, outlined the Canadian response to building what was called a quote-unquote resilient society. As Taves explains himself, quote, "In a resilient society, everyone, including governments, first responders, critical infrastructure operators, communities and individuals, knows what they need to do when faced with a terrorist attack, ensuring a rapid response to ordinary life." In an almost identical approach as the UK's Contest approach, the Canadian strategy adopts a fourfold strategy to build resilient communities, including what they call detect, deny, prevent, and respond. As one part of the fourfold strategy, the government introduced the Prevent Framework, aimed at preempting the uptake, adoption, and proliferation of terrorist ideologies among vulnerable individuals and groups. Like the UK strategy, the Prevent strategy seeks the collaboration of local, national, and international partners to counter violent extremism and provide alternative narratives to individuals and groups who may be transitioning towards violent activities. Canada's strategy also aims to mobilize and engage local community members, government officials, law enforcement, and public and private stakeholders as part of this counter-radicalization strategy. Despite the development of a national counter-radicalization program, Most interventions in Canada are local attempts to mobilize communities within the Prevent framework. For example, programs developed at the municipal level in Calgary and Montreal in 2005, known as Redirect and the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence respectively, represent cases where local law enforcement agencies have partnered with not-for-profits, private corporations, community organizations, researchers, social workers, and in some cases healthcare and educational professionals to offer referral services to direct individuals perceived to be vulnerable to radicalization into governmental interventions. While the efficacy of each program is yet to be analyzed in depth, in 2017, the Canadian government increased funding to take Redirect out of its pilot project stage, indicating that the program is at least effective from a governmental point of view. Calgary's Redirect program remains a law enforcement led by the Calgary Police Service, focusing on referring individuals who are judged to be at risk of radicalization into appropriate interventions. The explicit goal of the program is to identify, assess, and intervene in the lives of young people who are thought to be at risk of becoming radicalized under a terrorist ideology. Once an individual is referred into the program, a team of social workers, police officers, and case managers review the case and develop an individualized support plan that often includes referrals to other community support services, such as vocational training, social work support, and sports organizations. Unlike the Redirect program, the Center for the Prevention of Radicalization Leading to Violence offers a complex, multi-sectoral, and multi-objective structure to their counter-radicalization initiative. Mobilizing a research wing to develop analysis and empirical assessments of new developments in the field, a prevention and skills development team that focuses on raising public awareness and training people in vulnerable sectors to identify risky behaviors, and an intervention team that provides counseling, psychological assessment and support, and community resources to individuals referred to the center. This multi-sectoral approach is amongst the most innovative in the field because it is not fundamentally premised on channeling vulnerable individuals into governmental interventions. Rather, it aims to provide preemptive interventions or support for those projects as part of a system of community building and education, rather than a more traditional approach to countering the threat of terrorism top-down and led by law enforcement. While local and federal counter-radicalization initiatives in the United States remain aligned with traditional methods of policing that focus on community policing, arrests, intelligence, and surveillance, other jurisdictions like Canada have developed more holistic approaches that focus on broadening responsibility over matters of counterterrorism beyond law enforcement and intelligence. Law enforcement agencies, particularly in Canada and the UK, are thus increasingly involved in the development and delivery of awareness-focused educational and social support-focused programs aimed at intervening in and preventing radicalization before it can manifest. So the rearticulation of counterterrorism governance around preemptive intervention has been accompanied, at least in some jurisdictions, by an explicit effort to decenter the police in the policing of radicalization. In other words, to view the policing of terrorism as an all-encompassing strategy that encompasses a host of public actors rather than solely approaching it as an issue for big capital P police agencies. It is therefore important for sociologists to highlight some of the indirect consequences of the proliferation of new models of counter-radicalization policing strategies. These are empirical questions, and they must be assessed by sociologists in an empirical way. One example of what we might call, following Oxford criminologist Lucia Zedner, the emergence of a pre-crime logic amongst security institutions in the context of terrorism, whereby they craft interventions to operate along the journey from so-called normal, conventional thoughts, beliefs, or ideologies and activities towards more extremist views and ultimately violence, is Canada's now infamous security certificate regime. For Zedner, the past several decades of criminal justice policy has created a space, what she calls a pre-crime space, where we are increasingly criminalizing activities that precede any criminal act. In other words, criminal justice policy is increasingly criminalizing non-criminal activities that are supposedly antecedent to future criminal actions. While we have long criminalized some forms of pre-criminal activity, like conspiracy for instance, in Zedner's eyes, we're doing this more and more often, and it's incredibly problematic because, well, one of the fundamental principles of criminal law is that you cannot be convicted of a crime that you did not commit. So what happens if a crime is yet to be committed? How can we treat it as a criminal event? These questions are particularly important in the context of terrorism, where the stakes may be incredibly high and the prevention of massive tragic events may lie in the balance of how we treat these supposed pre-crime spaces. Counter-terrorism strategies over the past 2 decades have also stressed the importance of prevention and preemption over punitive reaction after the fact, in the form of, say, sending one to prison. An example of this preemptionary logic is the Canadian Security Certificate regime, outlined by Mike Larson and Justin Pichet. A security certificate is a mechanism through which Public Safety Canada may detain and possibly deport foreign nationals and other non-citizens living in Canada if they present a demonstrable threat to national security. It gets its legislative backing from the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or IRPA, and the subjects of a certificate are inadmissible to Canada and thus subject to a removal order. Where the government has reasonable grounds to believe that the individual in question is a danger to so-called national security, the individual can be detained without evidence of a criminal offense being committed, and they can be detained indefinitely. One of the key issues for critical scholars when it comes to security certificates is that they are often the result of in-camera or so-called secret trials. They are often, if not always, conducted under a veil of national security confidentiality and operate through administrative immigration law. Note the importance that it is part of IRPA here, rather than the criminal code, because it does not follow the traditional criminal justice proceedings if it were to follow under the criminal code. Certificates are issued under Section 77 of IRPA, which allows 2 ministers, the Minister of Public Safety and Citizenship and Immigration, to co-sign a document deeming a non-citizen inadmissible to Canada on what are called security grounds. It therefore barely resembles a typical criminal proceeding where one has the ability to defend oneself in open court. Once signed, the certificate is a warrant for the arrest and detention of the named individual. For Larson and Pichet, the Canadian Security Certificate regime is a textbook example of what renowned Canadian criminologist Richard Erickson calls counter law, or the establishment of a legal element that suspends other legal elements. In this case, the legal rights to trial, habeas corpus, and conviction. In other words, security certificates open up what Giorgio Agamben calls a state of exception, or a state where the suspension of laws or rights is justified due to emergency or exceptional circumstances, which may then become normalized in law. In this way, the Canadian Security Certificate regime is normalized in law as a permanent suspension of some elements of law. In this case, fundamental freedoms offered by the Charter for certain folks considered a threat to national security and justified through the exceptional threat that terrorism poses to society. Larson and Pichet also document the emergence and maintenance of the Kingston Immigration Holding Centre, housed within the walls of a federal detention facility in Bath, Ontario, just outside of Kingston. This facility, often dubbed Guantanamo North in reference to the American facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, is where folks held under security certificates were detained as part of the emergence of so-called special post-9/11 prisons for alleged terrorists. In Canada, the security certificate mechanism has been used 23 times since 1991, with 3 still outstanding. It has also been directly critiqued by legal scholars and sociologists as violating fundamental rights and freedoms protected by the Charter. Indeed, in 2007, the Supreme Court ruled in R.V. Charcui that the mechanism violated Section 7, 9, and 10 of the Charter, which forced a number of amendments to the mechanism in 2008. In 2009, both Charcui and Hassan Almray's certificates were quashed by a federal court, and a number of civil rights groups continue to maintain that the security certificate regime is in violation of Charter protections, making it increasingly difficult to continue using security certificates because of the host of civil liberty violations it presents. As you can see, counterterrorism can and has been used in a number of ways that may be incongruent with federal laws and constitutional rights. Indeed, the threat of terrorism has been widely successful in justifying the temporary, if not permanent, suspension or restructuring of laws and fundamental liberties protected by the Charter in various contexts. This all points to how important critical engagement with practices of counterterrorism is for sociologists. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about how various actors seek to counter and prevent terrorism, and perhaps more importantly from our perspective, I hope you learned about the social consequences of counterterrorism, surveillance, and police, and how we justify different social interventions through reference to the threat of terrorism. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Sociology of Terrorism.